dragged toward a line of horses. The girl doesn't scream. She lowers her eyes, as if silence might make her invisible. Her name is Zaria. At least it was, in lullabies and kitchen whispers. In the ledgers of the army that took her, she's something else. Age, height, hair, body type. A record. A resource. This isn't a story about a single raid or a single terror. It's about a machine built on purpose. A strategy that didn't just seize walls and gates, but reached for something far more permanent. The future. Under Genghis Khan, conquest wasn't measured only in cities burned or kings bent to the saddle. It was calculated in births, in bloodlines, in the quiet arithmetic of who survives to raise the next generation. Zaria's path is one thread in a vast design. Caravans that shadowed the armies, bureaucrats who counted daughters like grain, physicians who tracked cycles with the discipline of quartermasters. Territory can revolt. Fortresses can fall. But children grow up with the language of the household that raises them, with the story of who won written softly into their names. Tonight, we're not here to sensationalize pain. We're here to understand how a boy from the steppe became not only a conqueror of lands, but an architect of people. How wombs were turned into weapons and memory into resistance. How the map of Eurasia wasn't just redrawn in ink, but in DNA. Follow the hoofbeats. Listen for the jingle of tack and the scratch of a scribe's brush. Zaria is walking, and the empire is walking with her. The wind rolled across the Khorasan plain, carrying dust and the faint smell of burnt homes. Spring, 1220. A season that should have brought green shoots and soft rain now echoed only with hoofbeats and cries fading into silence. At the edge of the ruins, a mother stood still, her face streaked with soot, her hands trembling. Before her, a group of Mongol soldiers dragged a line of captives through the dust. Among them was her daughter, 14-year-old Zaria. The girl didn't scream. She knew that sound drew punishment. She only lowered her head, her hair hiding her face, her small frame swallowed by the vastness of an empire that was still growing. Her name, once whispered by her mother in lullabies, would soon vanish from language itself. In the records of the Mongol military, she would exist as a mark, age, height, body type, condition, an entry in a bureaucratic system that measured human life by utility. The soldiers moved quickly, efficient as craftsmen at their trade. Behind them, scribes followed, noting each captive, dividing them by age and health. Zaria felt a hand push her forward and stumbled, catching herself just before she fell. A man with a narrow beard and an ink-stained hand glanced at her, wrote something on a piece of parchment, and nodded to another guard. That was all it took. In a matter of seconds, she was processed, absorbed into the machinery of conquest that stretched from the steppes of Mongolia to the deserts of Persia. The empire was expanding, but it was not built only on swords. It was built on people, on the transformation of lives into data, of daughters into resources. Long before Zaria's capture, before her name became a number, the steppe had already forged the man who would shape her fate. His name was Temujin. Born around 1162, he came from a small tribe constantly harassed by stronger ones. When he was 9 years old, his father was poisoned by rivals. His mother, Holon, left with several children, struggled to keep them alive. They scavenged roots, caught fish by hand, ate what the earth offered. From that childhood of hunger, Temujin learned one truth. The world belonged to those who took, not those who waited to be taken. That belief grew inside him, colder than winter, harder than steel. It would one day define his empire. At 16, he experienced his first great loss. His promised bride, Borte, was taken by a rival tribe, the Merkid. For months, Temujin searched for her. When he finally found her, she was alive, but pregnant. Whose child it was, he would never know. That night changed him. Love was no longer a bond. It became a weapon. He realized that the womb could serve conquest as much as the sword. The pain of losing Borte became a lesson written into his philosophy of rule. Control the women, and you control the bloodline. Control the bloodline, and you control the world. Years passed, and Temujin gathered strength. He united the tribes of the steppe, not through mercy, but through method. By 1206, he had become Genghis Khan, universal ruler. He understood something no other conqueror had fully grasped. Violence could be organized. Conquest could be turned into a system. And within that system, reproduction could be weaponized. The Mongols' genius wasn't just in warfare, it was in administration. Every campaign, every victory, was followed by meticulous record-keeping. Populations were counted, divided, and categorized. It was empire through mathematics. By the time the Mongol army marched toward the Tangut Kingdom in 1209, this system was already taking shape. Before the siege, spies entered Tangut cities disguised as traders and healers. They conducted secret censuses. How many men, how many women, which families were noble, which bloodlines strong. Every detail was recorded on scrolls that later became the first industrial archives of sexual violence. When the city fell, the process began. Men of fighting age were executed. Skilled artisans were spared for the empire's projects. And the women were sorted into 3 groups. Primary reproducers, 14 to 30, healthy, no visible defects. Secondary reproducers, 31 to 40, preferably mothers already. The rest, those under 14, over 40, or sick, disappeared before dawn. Each woman selected for survival was branded on the wrist with ink that burned as it dried. The mark identified her as a unit of biological value. From then on, she belonged not to a tribe, not even to a person, but to the state. The Mongols did not waste resources. The women were loaded into caravans, long lines of wagons moving behind the army like a shadow. These caravans were not for spoils, they were for production. Divided into compartments, guarded by soldiers, managed by scribes, they carried the empire's most secret weapon, wombs. In these rolling cages, life and death coexisted. One section held women who were newly captured, another those already pregnant. Infants were separated within days. Some wagons held the weak and the sick, waiting for disposal. Mongol physicians experimented with herbs said to speed ovulation, with diets designed to increase fertility. Others performed crude surgeries to repair reproductive injuries. Every act was recorded, every pregnancy logged, every birth classified. Children born with desirable features, strong bones, narrow eyes, dark hair, were raised as Mongols. The rest were discarded. It was cruelty without chaos, efficiency without empathy. For girls like Zaria, the days blurred into one another. The air inside the wagons stank of sweat and milk. The guard spoke a language she barely understood. Sometimes she would hear crying from another compartment, sometimes singing. One night, she saw an older woman humming softly, her voice barely above a whisper. At first Zaria thought it was madness. Then others joined in. Each woman added a line, a melody, a fragment of her own lost world. The guards ignored them. To them, it was only noise. But to the captives, it was everything. It was memory. It was proof that they had existed before the empire claimed them. When the Mongols moved again, the caravan followed. Behind them lay cities reduced to ashes. Ahead stretched new lands waiting to be counted and conquered. The soldiers rode in front, shouting commands. Behind them came the carts, the scribes, the women. It was an army of 2 kinds, the army that killed and the army that would give birth. In the spring of 1211, when Genghis Khan turned his gaze toward the Jin Empire in northern China, the system was perfected. The empire no longer needed to station garrisons everywhere. It simply planted its legacy in the bodies of the conquered. One campaign captured more than 40,000 women. 2 years later, the caravans stretched for miles, 100,000 captives moving through steppe and sand. Each one was catalogued, tracked, and managed like livestock. Capture, classify, condition, impregnate, birth, reassign, eliminate. The process was mechanical, relentless, and unstoppable. To maintain order, resistance was punished with precision. Women who refused food were force-fed. Those who tried to abort were chained under watch. Some mutilated themselves to avoid pregnancy. They were kept alive just long enough to serve as warnings. Mothers who killed their own infants faced public torture. Execution turned into theater. The message was clear. The empire would decide who lived, who reproduced, and who vanished. But even within that machinery, rebellion flickered. It lived in silence, in the small acts the empire couldn't record. Women learned to communicate with gestures, tiny movements of the fingers or lips. They shared ways to fake illness, to induce miscarriages, to poison their own milk. Some starved themselves to stop their cycles. Others carved symbols into their skin to remember who they were. The Mongols could control bodies, but not entirely erase the will that resisted. Memory became defiance. Every whispered name, every hidden mark, was a rebellion too quiet for the empire to notice, but too human to die. Meanwhile, Genghis Khan expanded his logic. To him, this wasn't cruelty, it was policy. He saw the body as a tool of statecraft. Controlling reproduction meant building loyalty without having to build walls. Children born to conquered mothers would speak Mongol, think Mongol, and eventually die for Mongol causes. Within a single generation, the conquered would become indistinguishable from the conquerors. It was biological colonization, a conquest written in flesh instead of stone. By 1220, when Zaria's caravan crossed into the Khwarezmian territories, the system spanned continents. There were supply stations to inspect reproductive units, field hospitals for forced births, and sorting centers to determine each newborn's fate. The empire moved not just on horses, but on bloodlines. And behind the roar of battles, there was always the quieter sound of pens scratching against parchment, men documenting the creation of a new population. The Mongol Empire prided itself on order. To outsiders it appeared as chaos, but to those inside, it was terrifyingly organized. There was a form for every cruelty, a record for every death. Evil became a kind of paperwork, and within it, people like Zaria disappeared between the lines. One evening, after days of marching, her caravan stopped near a river. The guards lit torches. The scribes unrolled scrolls. One by one, the women were brought forward for inspection. When Zaria's turn came, she kept her eyes on the ground. A commander studied her face, her shoulders, her hands. Then he made a mark on the scroll. She didn't understand the language, but she understood the gesture. She had been chosen. For what? She couldn't know. As they branded her wrist, she bit her lip until she tasted blood. That night, she found a small piece of pottery on the ground and scratched her name into it. Zaria, daughter of no one. Still alive. The wind carried her breath into the darkness. Around her, thousands of others slept, their dreams silent, their names already forgotten. The fires burned low. Somewhere far ahead, an empire moved toward another city, another conquest, another counting. And behind it all, the same rhythm continued. The hoofbeats, the wheels, the scratching of quills recording lives erased. Empires are not only built on battles. Sometimes they grow in the spaces between screams, in the quiet moments where memory refuses to die. For every city Genghis Khan burned, he planted something else, something invisible, something living. Centuries later, science would find it written not in books, but in DNA, the lingering presence of one man's design. But for Zaria, the girl in the dust, there was only the march, the silence, and the faint, impossible hope that someone, someday, would remember her name. The sun rose red over the steppe, washing the horizon in the color of rust. The caravan stretched for miles, a slow-moving river of people swallowed by dust. Behind every wagon was a story erased and rewritten by force. Ahead, banners snapped in the wind, the symbol of the empire, the mark of order disguised as destiny. Zaria had been walking for weeks. Her body no longer registered pain. Her mind survived by retreating somewhere deep inside, where her mother's voice still existed. Each dawn, she woke to the same sound. The crack of a whip, the barked orders, the low murmurs of women whispering names to remind themselves that they once belonged somewhere. The Mongols believed what they were doing was not savagery, but strategy. To them, conquest without assimilation was waste. Genghis Khan's vision was simple. If a conquered people bore the children of their conquerors, resistance would dissolve in the blood of future generations. Cities could rebel, kings could rise again, but bloodlines would remain loyal. Territory fades, lineage endures. This idea was called the system of permanent seeding. It wasn't just a policy, it was the biological spine of an empire. Historians would later describe it as the most organized form of population control the medieval world had ever seen. Every battle, every victory, every woman captured was part of a greater design. The goal was not extermination, but transformation. In 1219, when the Mongols invaded the Khwarezmian Empire, the system reached its perfect form. Cities like Bokhara, Samarkand, and myrrh fell not only to cavalry but to procedure. Before the walls were breached, spies infiltrated and made detailed maps, not of streets or fortresses, but of households. They recorded family structures, ages of daughters, known pregnancies, fertility patterns. When the army arrived, they knew exactly what they were taking. The city gates fell with thunder. Soldiers poured through like water breaking a dam. Within hours, flames devoured the market district, temples collapsed into ash, and the sounds of conquest filled the air, steel, screams, and the eerie calm of clerks doing their work. Men were gathered and executed in groups of 10. Artisans were separated and chained. The rest, especially women, were lined up for classification. Those between 14 and 30 were inspected for health, marked with ink, and loaded onto caravans. Older women, especially mothers, were often kept a few weeks longer. The Mongols had discovered something through experience. Mothers with newborns resisted less when they believed their children might survive. For the first 3 months, mother and infant stayed together. After that, the child was taken away, and the mother was sent back to the main line of the caravan. This was not chaos. It was logistics. Even cruelty followed a schedule. The caravans that rolled out of Khwarezmian cities were organized like mobile factories. Each had divisions: initial capture, acclimatization, pregnancy, childbirth, postpartum, reassignment. Supervisors were assigned to each. Mongol physicians and scribes traveled among them, taking notes, administering herbs, and recording pregnancies with cold precision. The empire had turned reproduction into an instrument of administration. Zaria's caravan was one of many moving west. They crossed deserts where bones cracked underfoot and rivers where corpses drifted past. Some nights, the soldiers would count the dead not out of compassion but out of necessity. Each corpse meant a loss in projected births. The empire was calculating its future through the suffering of its captives. There was a strange order in the horror. Wagons carrying pregnant women had guards with medical supplies and midwives taken from conquered lands. Others, carrying the weak and barren, had fewer guards. Those women were expendable. The empire measured value by fertility. A woman's life expectancy was determined by her ability to conceive. When a child was born, it was inspected like merchandise. Scribes examined eye shape, hair color, skin tone, limb proportions. Babies considered suitable were taken to Mongol families to be raised as their own. Those deemed unfit were quietly removed. Mothers learned not to ask where the crying went when it stopped. They already knew. Zaria watched it all and stopped feeling shock. She existed now in survival mode. Her body obeyed orders. Her mind lived in another world, one built of memory and imagination. She still saw her mother in dreams, standing by the ruins, silent, strong, alive in the only way memory allows. The Mongols' discipline was absolute. Each caravan had scribes who tallied pregnancies the way generals tallied victories. They recorded every miscarriage, every stillbirth, every defective child. The Khan's administrators later used those records to predict population shifts in newly conquered regions. Conquest was becoming an early form of population engineering. The brutality was systematic, but it wasn't mindless. Genghis Khan believed he was building something that would last beyond his death, a world unified by language, blood, and law. In his mind, every forced union was a seed planted in the soil of the future. But the women did not vanish into statistics quietly. Within the caravans, they built small networks of resistance, not open rebellion, but the quiet rebellion of endurance. They developed a language of signs. A raised finger meant a safe person. A touch on the wrist meant watch the guards. Some shared ancient herbal knowledge, ways to delay conception, to induce fevers that prevented pregnancy. Others carved small symbols into the wood of the wagons, marks that told those who came after that someone had lived, someone had fought in silence. Their greatest weapon was memory. Even when they could no longer speak their own languages freely, they whispered old songs at night, humming melodies that carried the names of their ancestors. Those songs became lullabies for babies who would never know where they came from. It was a form of defiance the empire could not catalog. As the empire expanded, the numbers multiplied. By 1220, over 200,000 women had been absorbed into the Mongol reproductive system. Entire regions became demographic experiments. Mongol officers received quotas, how many seed bearers were to be delivered, how many pregnancies to be confirmed, how many children to be relocated to Mongol families. Each number represented a life rewritten, a future redirected. When Genghis Khan looked at his maps, he did not see territory, he saw generations. Every victory created not just borders, but bloodlines. He once said, "A conquered land that breeds Mongol sons is never lost." Whether or not those words were truly his, they summarized the empire's logic. The conquest of the womb was the conquest of permanence. The system reached its cruel peak after Genghis Khan's death in 1227. His successors inherited not only his armies, but his policies. Ogdi Khan refined the records in Europe, expanding the breeding system among Slavic captives. Monk Khan applied it in the Middle East. Kublai Khan institutionalized it in China, blending it with bureaucratic governance. Each generation turned the practice into doctrine. What began as a strategy of war became a foundation of empire. Centuries later, archaeologists would uncover the aftermath. Mass graves of young women and children, skeletons showing fractures from forced marches, signs of malnutrition and childbirth under duress. DNA tests revealed mixed ancestry stretching across Asia and into Eastern Europe. The statistics were staggering. About 16 million men alive today may carry the Y chromosome of Genghis Khan's direct line. But behind that number lies what history often forgets: the countless voices silenced, the mothers and daughters who vanished without a name. Zaria's story is not recorded in any chronicle. Her existence was never written down, except perhaps as a line of ink that has long since faded. But somewhere in the genetic memory of millions, fragments of stories like hers remain. Every cell that carries that ancient signature carries, too, the shadow of her march, the sound of her heartbeat, the echo of her mother's song. The empire that once claimed her would eventually crumble. Cities would rise from the ashes, borders would shift, and languages would change. But the conquest of bloodlines, that remained. It still moves silently through history, connecting strangers across continents who share fragments of the same ancestral thread. Empires die, records burn, monuments fall. But the things that happen in the body, those live on. The Mongols understood that better than anyone. They didn't just conquer land, they conquered time. And in the middle of it all, a girl once named Zaria walked through the dust, leaving behind no monument, no grave, no story. Only a trace in the blood of the living, the faint echo of a name that refused to disappear. The Mongol banners cut through the wind like blades, their black horses galloping toward the horizon of another conquest. By 1220, the empire of Genghis Khan had grown beyond imagination. From the Great Wall of China to the Caspian Sea, from frozen Siberia to the burning sands of Persia. But the true engine that kept it alive wasn't just steel or fire. It was biology. Every march, every campaign, every caravan of captives moved under the same invisible law. The empire must grow through the womb as much as through war. Behind the roaring victories were quieter operations, field scribes cataloging mothers, physicians managing births, and administrators calculating how long it would take for a conquered population to turn Mongol by blood. This was no longer conquest, it was harvest. At the heart of this design was Genghis Khan's understanding that people forget the conqueror who kills them, but they remember the one who fathers them. In his mind, the body of the conquered was a vessel through which his empire could survive the fall of walls, the collapse of kingdoms, even his own death. He had learned the hard way, through hunger, loss, and betrayal, that violence could destroy, but only lineage could preserve. And so, the machinery of birth became the new frontier of control. The machinery perfected. When the Mongols stormed the Khwarezmian city of Merv, hundreds of thousands were slaughtered in a single week. Yet amid the ashes, another army began its work, the scribes and midwives of the empire's biological core. Each surviving woman of childbearing age was registered, evaluated, and assigned. Those deemed prime were sent eastward, towards central processing centers along the caravan routes. Those less valuable were distributed among military units as spoils. The empire called it repopulation, but there was nothing natural about it. Wagons followed the front lines carrying herbs, medicines, and scrolls filled with careful records of every conception. The empire even developed early systems for tracking lineage, Children born from Mongol fathers were given special identifiers to ensure their placement within loyal families. Over time, these identifiers evolved into something like a caste system: pure Mongol, half-blood, integrated, and expendable. This cold hierarchy turned motherhood into administration. Some women, the ones who gave birth successfully to Mongol-featured sons, were granted slightly better treatment: small rations of dried meat, a clean cloth, sometimes even the right to live another year. Others who miscarried or birthed girls were sent to the back of the caravan, where illness and exhaustion finished what the empire began. To keep the system efficient, Mongol physicians experimented with fertility-enhancing diets: mare's milk mixed with ground herbs, fermented grains meant to strengthen the seed. They treated childbirth as a form of engineering and failure as a mechanical defect. Every new birth was another step toward a future the Khan envisioned, a continent knit together by his bloodline. The logic of forever. Empires built on conquest often collapse from rebellion. But Genghis Khan built a machine that couldn't rebel. It didn't rely on walls or soldiers. It relied on children. By the time those children grew up, their loyalties were already rewritten, not by force, but by ancestry. Territory can be retaken, but blood cannot. Modern genetic studies prove what the chronicles only hinted at. Across Asia, millions carry traces of the same Y chromosome, the one that once belonged to Genghis Khan or his close male relatives. 1 in every 200 men alive today, nearly 16 million people, are his descendants. It is not legend. It is measurable. But what those statistics hide is the human cost: the mothers and daughters erased, the nameless captives who became vessels of empire. Their pain became invisible, absorbed into a number. History remembers the conqueror. Biology remembers his victims. The dynasty of control. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his sons and grandsons inherited not only his empire, but his blueprint. Ogdi, his successor, refined the reproductive policies in Europe. Mongol raids in Hungary and Poland followed the same pattern: capture, classify, impregnate, assimilate. Monk Khan applied it in the Middle East. Cities of the Abbasid Caliphate saw the same systematic separation of families. The Mongols kept detailed lists of artisans, priests, and women, always the women. And then came Kublai Khan, who extended the empire into China. There, the system fused with Confucian bureaucracy. Birth registries became imperial documents. Women of conquered ethnicities were recorded, matched to soldiers, and their offspring raised in Mongol Chinese households. The conquest had become cultural policy. What began as a wartime tactic turned into a dynastic principle. Each new ruler inherited not only power, but also the unspoken mandate to expand the bloodline. Zaria's march. Through all of this, Zaria still walked. The caravan she belonged to had become a moving city. Thousands of captives, hundreds of guards, a rhythm of wheels, screams, and songs. By now she no longer cried. The tears had burned out of her long ago. She learned the routines: the dawn inspection, the evening count, the guards' habits, the sound of the scribe's brush scraping against parchment. She memorized faces, not to remember them, but to know who was safe, who might share food, who might whisper. At night, under the canvas of stars, she whispered her own name again and again. Sometimes she said it out loud, sometimes only in her mind. Each repetition was a small rebellion, proof that she still existed, even if the empire didn't think so. One evening, as the caravan rested near a ruined city, Zaria met a woman from Samarkand. The woman's name was Alira, older, with a scar on her temple and eyes that had seen too much. Alira taught her a trick: how to feign illness by mixing sand with water to make the lips look pale, how to fake fainting to be moved to the rear wagons, where supervision was looser. There, Alira said, you can breathe for a while. For the first time in months, Zaria smiled. Not because she felt hope, but because someone had remembered how to teach, how to share, how to be human. The shadows of resistance. Within the caravans, resistance began to spread in whispers. Women used fragments of fabric to tie knots. 1 knot meant safe, 2 meant danger. They marked wagons with hidden signs, carved into the wood beneath sleeping mats. A circle meant a friendly guard. A triangle meant death. They shared knowledge of plants that could induce miscarriages, passed from one culture to another like sacred scripture. They hummed songs in forbidden languages. They remembered each other's faces, not because it would save them, but because forgetting would mean surrender. Some nights, they buried messages, tiny scraps of cloth with names written in soot and blood. They hid them beneath the wheels of wagons, under stones, inside cracks in the earth. Perhaps, centuries later, someone might find them. Perhaps no one ever would. But to write a name was to defy oblivion. The science of dominion. To the Mongols, this was empire at its most efficient. There were supply stations designed solely to sustain the caravans. They had lists of productive regions, places where women were known to bear healthy children, and exhausted zones, where disease had lowered fertility. They created specialized teams called cotton units, responsible for managing childbirth, tracking pregnancies, and transporting infants. Every few months, these units would deliver newborns to settlements designated for assimilation. From there, the children were placed in Mongol households and raised with new identities. It was population management centuries before the term existed. The empire treated people the way merchants treated livestock, through balance sheets, reports, and quotas. And yet, to the Mongols, this wasn't cruelty. It was seen as divine order, an extension of the will of Tungri, the eternal blue sky. In their cosmology, Genghis Khan was the chosen instrument of that will, spreading not just rule but blood. Legacy of the invisible war. By the time the great Khan's body was buried somewhere beneath the mountains of Mongolia, his seed had already transformed the genetic landscape of half a continent. His descendants ruled in every direction. The Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Yuan dynasty in China. Each carried the same code, not just in their governance, but in their blood. Centuries later, the evidence would emerge not from chronicles, but from laboratories. Scientists studying Y chromosomes discovered a pattern that could only be explained by rapid expansion from a single male lineage around the 13th century, centered precisely on Mongolia. Genghis Khan had conquered not only geography, but heredity itself. And yet, for all his success, the cost was unbearable. The empire's maps do not show the valleys filled with unmarked graves, the bones of women and children who built the foundation of his eternity. Those who remember his genius often forget his victims, the women who refuse to vanish. But memory, even buried, finds a way back to the surface. In the songs of nomadic tribes, in the lullabies of Central Asia, in the rhythms of folk melodies that have no recorded origin, traces of those voices still live. Ethnomusicologists have found tonal patterns that blend Mongol, Persian, and Khwarezmian influences, songs of mothers sung in languages that no longer exist, carried by generations who never knew their source. Perhaps one of those songs began with Zaria. Perhaps she survived. Perhaps she didn't. No chronicle will ever say. But every whispered name, every melody that refuses to die, is proof that even the greatest empire cannot fully erase the people it consumes. The Mongols conquered the body, but never the spirit. History remembers the Khan as a unifier, a strategist, a storm from the east. But beneath his empire lay another history, one carved not in stone, but in flesh. His victory wasn't only written on maps, it was written in chromosomes. And so, centuries later, when scientists trace the invisible lines of DNA across continents, they are reading not just the legacy of a man, but the silent chronicle of millions of women who carried the empire inside them. They are reading the story of Zaria, of Illyria, of thousands without graves or names. An empire built on blood. An empire that outlived its banners. An empire that still breathes in the bodies of the living. The empire of Genghis Khan did not end when his heart stopped beating. It continued, quietly, relentlessly, in the pulse of humanity itself. The snow came early that year. By the time the last Mongol caravans retreated from the western plains, frost had already claimed the grass. The wind that once carried the dust of burning cities now moved quietly over the burial fields. Fields no one would mark, no stone, no name. Only earth piled over the forgotten. For centuries, the story of those women and children remained hidden beneath that soil. The chronicles written by the victors celebrated empire, not agony. The Mongol scribes recorded victories, taxes, births of heirs, but not the cries that followed the armies. History moved forward, proud and loud, while silence became the monument of the nameless. But silence, like blood, has memory. 800 years later, in the deserts and valleys once ruled by the Khan, that memory began to speak again, not through words, but through bones. Archaeologists digging outside ancient Bokhara uncovered mass graves of women and infants. The skeletons were small, fragile, many showing signs of malnutrition, of broken ribs, of wrists deformed by ropes. Some were buried side by side, some still holding each other. The scientists noticed something strange. Among the remains, the genetic patterns did not match local ancestry. The mitochondrial DNA, passed only from mothers, told a story of diversity. Women from Persia, Khwarezm, the Caucasus, even the edges of Eastern Europe. They had been brought here, moved across continents, used, and then buried together. It was the first physical evidence of the caravans. In another site further east, researchers found the skeleton of a teenage girl lying beside an older woman. Tests showed they were mother and daughter, but from different regions. The daughter carried the genetic markers of the steppes, the mother of Persia. The scientists realized the truth. The mother had been taken west, the daughter born in captivity, raised as a Mongol asset, and then forced to march east again. A circle of life and death written by empire. That circle repeated itself across the continent. Excavations in Samarkand, Karakoram, and northern China revealed the same pattern. Clusters of female graves, separated from male burials, all dating to the same decades. History's quiet evidence began to align with legend. And from the soil, a darker story emerged, one not told by chroniclers or kings. The empire eventually fractured, as all empires do. After Genghis Khan's death, the Mongol domains splintered into 4 khanates. The armies grew tired, the administrators corrupt, and the bloodlines diluted. Yet even in collapse, the genetic footprint of conquest endured. The descendants of those forced unions lived on, not as Mongols, not as Persians, not as Chinese, but as something new, born from violence and necessity. They became farmers, merchants, nomads, wanderers who carried pieces of multiple worlds in their veins. They didn't know their history, but their blood did. Every generation, that blood spread further, carried by trade, by migration, by love, and by chance. The empire that had sought to control biology could not predict that biology would outlive control. What Genghis Khan created was both monstrous and magnificent, an unintentional unity of mankind. His violence scattered lineages so wide that, 8 centuries later, science would prove what the poets could only imagine, that millions across Eurasia share one ancestor, a man whose name became myth. But beneath the awe of genetics lies the ache of history. Every shared chromosome hides a story of loss, a lineage born not of love, but of command. Long after the empire fell, echoes of its human machinery survived in song. In the mountains of Central Asia, women still sing lullabies whose origins no one can fully trace. Melodies that blend Mongol throat tones with Persian scales, lyrics that speak of rivers, of dust, of captivity, of mothers whispering names into the dark. Folklorists who recorded these songs found recurring patterns, names that appear in no written record, fragments of stories about the march, the brand, the women of the wagons. No one remembers when the songs began, but their rhythm carries centuries of silence. One verse, collected in northern Afghanistan, speaks of a girl who walked between suns, her hands bound, her name hidden in her child's breath. Scholars call it myth. But maybe it was memory, the long echo of Zaria's generation, turned into music so it could survive where words could not. These songs, scattered across regions, became invisible testimonies. In every refrain, the dead are remembered. The empire that sought to erase them had, without meaning to, built a bridge through time. Their sorrow embedded in art, their DNA in people, their stories in air. In the 21st century, the story of Genghis Khan returned, not as a legend, but as data. Scientists at Oxford and the University of Leicester studied Y chromosome markers across Asia. The results stunned them. Around 16 million men, roughly 1 in every 200 on Earth, share a nearly identical sequence originating from Mongolia around 1200 CE. That single genetic thread runs through China, Central Asia, Russia, the Middle East, and even Eastern Europe. In some regions, like Mongolia and Kyrgyzstan, up to 8% of men carry that mark. It is the largest known biological legacy of any single human in history. And yet, science says nothing about how that legacy was created. DNA can tell who fathered whom, but not what it cost. The numbers speak of dominance, not of despair. The charts do not show the hunger, the marches, the women branded and renamed. Modern historians debate whether Genghis Khan's system was planned or circumstantial, whether his genetic impact came from deliberate policy or the chaos of conquest. But those debates mean little to the ghosts beneath the earth. Whether calculated or not, the result is the same, an empire that colonized the future through the body. No record tells us what became of Zaria. But if her caravan followed the known routes, she might have reached the Caspian by winter of 1221. By then, hundreds had already died. The survivors were split, some sent to garrisons, others to noble camps. Perhaps she lived long enough to give birth. Perhaps she died before that. If she lived, her child would have been taken, raised in a tent under a new name, fed by strangers, taught to ride and to fight. That child might have grown to command others, never knowing that his mother once marched across deserts as a captive. That is the cruel symmetry of history. The empire that destroyed her would one day live through her descendants. And so, her name, whispered into the wind, might have survived after all, not in books, not in monuments, but in the blood of strangers who walk the earth today, unaware that they carry the echo of a girl who refused to scream. Genghis Khan's empire teaches us that conquest is not always made of battles. Sometimes it is made of numbers, of bloodlines, of bureaucrats with ink-stained hands counting women as they once counted cattle. The empire turned biology into empire, and empire into eternity. But even eternity can be haunted. Every time a genetic study maps human ancestry, his name returns. Every time a historian writes of empire, the silence of women rises behind it. The Mongols believe they were chosen by the sky, but the sky remembers everything. The cries, the ashes, the names carved in pottery, the songs sung by captives at night. The story of Genghis Khan is not just the story of power. It is the story of what power costs, and who pays for its immortality. Empires end, but the truth never does. The soil keeps the bones. The blood keeps the record. And the wind, still moving across the steppes, still carries the sound of her name. The wind never stops moving across the Mongolian plain. It hums through grass the way it once whistled through banners, soft now where it used to roar. 800 years have passed since Genghis Khan's horsemen thundered across continents. The bones of his empire have turned to dust, yet his shadow remains, not on maps, but in the bloodstream of the living. The empire he built with swords and ledgers no longer exists, but the system he designed lives on, inside us. Every cell that carries the faint echo of his lineage is a fragment of that great machine, a molecule of history. Science has turned myth into measurable fact. When researchers mapped the world's Y chromosomes, they didn't expect to find one man's signature imprinted on an entire hemisphere. But there it was, a single pattern, radiating outward from Mongolia like ripples from a stone thrown into a lake. It crossed deserts, mountains, oceans of time. It was Genghis Khan's final conquest, invisible, unstoppable, eternal. Yet numbers alone mean nothing without stories. 16 million descendants sound impressive until you realize what they represent. The silence of millions of women whose names were erased so that one name could echo forever. Every successor in that statistic is built on a foundation of absence. A child born because someone else had no choice. History likes to talk about Genghis Khan as a genius, strategist, lawgiver, the man who connected East and West. But genius is often measured by distance. The further away we are, the easier it is to forget the screams beneath it. His empire modernized trade, created postal routes, promoted meritocracy, and codified laws across civilizations. It also industrialized captivity, regulated violence, and made reproduction a tool of power. It was humanity's first biological empire, and perhaps its last. The world we live in still bears the fingerprints of that logic. Nations still draw lines around identity, around blood, around who belongs and who doesn't. The language has changed, the science has evolved, But the instinct is the same, to measure human value by inheritance, not by humanity. When scientists today speak of the Genghis Khan haplotype, they speak of dominance, expansion, legacy. They rarely speak of Zaria. But Zaria's story is also in that data, hidden beneath the graphs and numbers, woven into the base pairs of DNA that whisper of survival through suffering. She is the unrecorded line in every family tree, the heartbeat beneath statistics. She is proof that memory doesn't die, it only changes form. In a sense, Genghis Khan achieved the immortality he sought. His genes roam the earth. His empire exists in blood. But immortality, when built on pain, is not victory, it's haunting. For every descendant who carries his mark, there's an ancestor who carried his burden. When the caravans finally stopped moving, when the last branded woman disappeared into the steppes, the empire began to devour itself. His sons fought over inheritance. His generals turned against each other. Power shifted, borders collapsed, and the same machinery that once conquered the world began to rust. But what could not rust was the code, the unseeable script written into the human genome. It was the only part of his empire that truly lasted. Centuries later, that script continues to speak, not in words, but in faces. The faces of shepherds in the Altai Mountains, merchants in Samarkand, farmers in Kazakhstan, children in Poland, sailors in Iran. The diversity of skin, the curve of an eye, the shape of a jaw, tiny echoes of one lineage that refused to disappear. And yet, to remember Genghis Khan is not to worship him. It is to understand what happens when the desire to rule the world turns inward, when conquest stops being about land and becomes about life itself. He conquered everything that could be seen, and then he conquered what could not, the invisible. That conquest still raises a question that history cannot answer. At what point does genius become evil? At what point does control become annihilation? There is a strange irony in it. The man who built the largest empire in history is remembered less for his cruelty than for his cleverness. The woman who lost everything to that empire is not remembered at all. And yet, she lives in millions who have never heard her name. That is the paradox of legacy. It preserves and erases in the same breath. The Mongols built an empire meant to last forever, and in a way, it did. But not in the way they imagined. Its monuments crumbled, its language faded, its borders dissolved. What endured was the smallest, most fragile part of humanity, the cell. A whisper in the code of life that no empire could destroy. If you listen to the wind over the steppes at night, it sounds almost like breath. The same breath that once filled the lungs of soldiers, mothers, captives, and kings. The land remembers them all equally. Time erases names, but not echoes. Maybe somewhere, buried beneath centuries of soil, Zaria's bones still rest. Or maybe they were scattered, lost to rivers and sand. It doesn't matter. Her story is not in the ground. It's in the fact that life continued. That even the empire that used her body as a tool could not stop her legacy from becoming part of the human story. We tend to think of history as something written by victors. But history also writes itself in the defeated, in the lullabies that survived, in the genes that persist, in the whispers that refuse to die. Every time someone traces their ancestry and finds a connection to Mongolia, they are touching that history, not as glory, but as reminder. The reminder that empire may build monuments, but humanity builds memory. The world that Genghis Khan helped create, interconnected, global, borderless in commerce but divided in spirit, still carries his contradictions. He united continents and destroyed civilizations. He gave birth to nations and erased others. He was both creator and destroyer, the god of birth and the ghost of annihilation. And so, 8 centuries later, when we speak his name, we should speak not only of what he conquered, but of what he broke. We should remember the millions whose blood became the mortar of his immortality. Because in the end, every empire built on suffering must face the reckoning of memory. And memory, silent, patient, eternal, always outlives power. Zaria's name, spoken once by her mother as the soldiers took her away, still drifts in that wind. It has no nation, no monument, no line in the records of kings. But it exists, carried inside the people who unknowingly bear her legacy. That is the true empire, not the one of armies or banners, but of blood, of endurance, of the unwilling who became immortal through survival. The empire of Genghis Khan is gone. The empire of Zaria remains.